Hey everyone, here for another episode of the New Stack Makers. We are doing a series of recordings with Okta. And our topic today is all about those hacks, out there that create those horror stories. And we're actually seeing some of these interesting stories emerge today, maybe not in terms of hacks in the traditional way you might see them, but what's happening on Wall Street is really kind of a hack. And I'd like to introduce my co-host for the show for this series, Randall Degges, Head of Developer Advocacy at Okta. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me, Alex. I'm super excited to be here for this series on security topics. It's something that I'm really into. As you said, I run developer advocacy at Okta. I'm also an engineer who's been working in the security industry for about 15 years now, and I just absolutely love it. So super excited.
Awesome. And our guest today is Marc Rogers, who's Vice President of Cybersecurity at Okta and co-founder of the CTI League. Marc also, as I understand, had a role to play in defining the hacks for Mr. Robot.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's great to be with you guys. I wear many hats. So obviously I have my Okta role. I have my CTI League role. But I'm also the head of security for the hacker conference DEF CON. So I get to see a lot of crazy stuff going on. And the Mr. Robot thing is one of those that came out of that.
Wow.
And not to mention, but if you're listening to this through audio and not video, Marc has one of the best sysadmin beards of all time. Definitely like a wizard. So you guys are missing out if you're not seeing the video feed.
Thank you, Randall. I promise not to shave until we all get released from our houses.
Well, good for you. Yeah, so we were just actually having a really interesting conversation because one of the topics I really find interesting is I find a topic actually gets really interesting when you start thinking about the abstractions around the topic and what those actually mean. And we were starting to talk a little bit about hacks and what's happening on Wall Street right now. And Marc was saying that this is more of an influencer operation more than anything else. And what we're seeing is the inflation almost, or I don't know what you would call it, but they're driving up prices for stocks that the traditional investors, the hedge funds, have been betting to be actually go down. Maybe you could give us a little example or a little insight into this, Marc, as you're explaining it pretty well. And it seems to me speaks to what actually makes for horror stories in many ways with these security hacks.
Sure. And one of the interesting things about this is it's actually a really good example of what influencer operations are capable of. People will have heard of some of these sorts of operations in the past. If, for example, you remember the K-pop stands and them booking out one of Trump's events in mass, that's an influencer type operation. The world has changed. In the old days, it used to be that specific leaders or specific organizations held the power and influence. But now that's distributed. So somebody like Taylor Swift can command more influence than a senator. And that has led to some interesting effects. And so what's going on Wall Street is that a lot of folks in Reddit have gone together and have decided that they're going to squeeze companies that are essentially investing against the success in other companies. So companies that short stock and hold positions shorting them. And the way they're doing that is by using simple supply and demand and market influence. By buying more and more of the stock, the price goes up. And these companies are betting that the price is going to go down. And so they keep this up and they keep putting the pressure on by buying more. And what's happening is you're getting these Wall Street giants who hold billion-dollar funds being squeezed by kids with their stimulus checks. And that's the power of influence.
It's also fascinating, too, because the particular case you're talking about is what's going on right now. I mean, we're recording this at the end of January 2021. And some of the biggest news on the internet on Reddit is really focused around this GameStop, like Wall Street bets subreddit squeeze or whatever, right, Marc? Can you talk a little bit more about that in particular and like why this is so like new? Because I haven't really seen this before, and just keeping up with the news is absolutely fascinating.
So the new part about it is that this is coordinated, influence-driven investment by retail investors, ordinary folks using their ordinary money to buy into stuff. And they're leveraging the fact that you can now trade pretty easily and for free online with a whole bunch of different platforms to do that. But the rest of it's simple market mechanics. They're bringing a big army of people together, and they're all moving in the same direction. They're not just targeting GameStop. They're targeting all of the kind of like popular short-sold stocks. So stocks that people were betting against, and squeezing all of them, which is really unfortunate for the companies that hold positions where they're expecting these stocks to go down, and instead are finding that some of them have gone from, like the case of GameStop, from $10, $20 stocks up to $400 stocks. That's a really difficult position for them to keep holding. So now it's kind of a who blinks first type scenario. Can they maintain their positions, or are they going to bail? And if they bail, they're going to have to eat the cost.
It definitely seems reminiscent to me. I'm putting everything in programmer terms, the way my brain works, but almost like a distributed denial of service attack, right? Like you might have a bunch of applications running on a bunch of unknown, zombie processes or whatever it might be, some compromised systems around the world that all start just doing something all at the same time. In this case, it's random Redditors with a few $1,000s on Wall Street bets buying up GameStop, shares. But is that the same thing, or are there fundamental differences between the two?
I think the closest similarity, if you want to equate it into denial of service terms, is more a layer 7 type denial of service, where you're targeting specific functions in an application because they use more resource than just hitting everything. By a traditional denial of service, you just throw garbage at the machine until it gets swamped. But that's gotten harder and harder with defensive systems. But if you go after specifically, weak spots where functions are exposed that use up a lot of resources, and you hammer them, for relatively small amounts of investment, you can cause quite a huge amount of resource debt at the other end. And that's sort of a close analogy, but I don't think it's really good to equate this as denial of service, because this isn't really seeking to break. This is actually seeking to create a profit scenario for those people who are participating. The difference is they're doing it in a way that's going to be at the disadvantage of the more traditional folks. And this is really a classic of old meets new. And I think we're going to be learning about this and the effects of this in economics textbooks and university classes for decades to come.
Absolutely fascinating. The topic of today's episode is really all about security horror stories. And personally, I think you have some of the most interesting damn security stories I've ever heard. Is there anything in particular from your career you might want to share that about maybe a security instance that just went terribly wrong that we could talk about?
Yeah, so the first one I thought that would be a really great one to talk about is about really understanding secure by design. So if you're building something to be secure, you need to think about it, and you need to think about it from a lot of different directions. You can't just put all your investment in making one part of it secure without understanding the relationship everything else has. A lot of people have probably seen the meme of the security gate standing in a field with car tracks going around either side of it. This is actually a real world kind of version of that. And so in this scenario, the organization that I was working for had to put in place a high security access system and a high security entryway into a secure facility. And we're talking about a door that's been rated for multiple hours of protection against automatic tooling, and a digital number pad with biometric backups to allow access, everything. And so it's, pretty clever design. The one big concern about it was everything was electrical. You have to have power to power the keypad. You have to have power to do the biometrics. The locks are all electric locks. And so if the power went out, there had to be some sort of solution to get around it. And the solution was there's essentially a key that were supposed to be stored offsite in a secure location. Well, as happens often, the unexpected became the expected, and the power went out. And what we found was that the person in charge of the key had not removed it from the premises, and so it was inside the secure location. And so we're standing out there looking at the work we've done in building this secure facility, thinking, well, how are we going to get into this now? And called in a locksmith to take a look to see if there's any kind of way that we might be able to bypass it. And the guy looks around, and I kid you not, after about 5 minutes, taps the wall, punches through the plasterboard, grabs the wires, and then reactivates the door and opens it. And then we're all just standing there like, all of this money was spent on building this massively secure, super smart door, and the wall is just plasterboard.
So the wall was just plasterboard. And so, so I could just see kind of like the television show behind us, like, well, we need more plasterboard, don't we? We need more. We don't need plasterboard. We need concrete.
Well, right. I mean, and if you look at other kind of designs for this type of facility, you'd expect there to be like a shielded cage with resistant structure all around it, but that just completely got missed off. And it's a classic example of, all the design energy got focused onto making sure this door was the state of the art, but nobody thought about the big picture.
So this locksmith was a hacker, right? He figured it out. He figured out how to get in, and then that's what brings to me to makes me curious. Like, what is the motivation of the attacker, and does that play a part in understanding some of these really bad horror stories? Is like the attackers themselves, and what are they really trying to achieve? And I guess it must be anything across the board. Like your example of these people on Reddit who are using their stimulus checks. I don't know what their motivation is, but there has to be something. And I'm curious on how that plays into your context about these horror stories that you've heard about and you've been a part of.
Yeah, I think actually that is a really important point. So I'm notorious for the fact that I don't actually like attribution that much. I think it's important, but I don't think it's as important as some people make it out. It makes a great story, but the reality is, in the vast majority of cases, you can't do anything with that attribution information, or you're very constrained in what you can do. Where it is useful, and the thing that is useful, is understanding the motivation and the techniques. Because once you understand those, the motivation will often help guide you in understanding the techniques, and the techniques will help guide you in understanding what the risk is. And those together will help you shape the way you should approach it. How much money should you invest in protecting something? If the thing is only worth $100,000 to the person coming after it, there's really no point in spending millions of dollars in protecting it. You just need to try and make the protection proportional and appropriate. And the same goes in terms of understanding, like, if something is so valuable to someone that they will throw anything at it, then you need to rethink exactly how you're going to defend it, because you could probably throw money at, and they will still outspend you. And when you're dealing with some of the budgets that you potentially end up dealing with in the adversary space, such as foreign nations, like, they have unlimited spend. I always said to some of my CEOs when talking about security plans for this kind of category of thing is, hey, I will never have a budget that can match theirs. And so what we have to do is be smart about security and not just throw money at the problem.
That's absolutely fascinating, especially in like the world of computer crimes and things. It seems like budgets are just absolutely massive. There's the SolarWinds hack that happened recently. I'm not sure how much information you have about that, but it seems as if foreign actors, governments, et cetera, just have really unlimited resources to conduct these very remote attacks on very complex systems, whether that be attempting to break expensive password hashes across a massive cluster of servers and things like that. What can people like us in the industry do to help, I guess, prevent these things in the future? Because it seems like just a really difficult problem.
So I think we are guilty of overcomplicating the problem. So you're absolutely right. There are some very sophisticated attacks, and one of those unicorn attacks is actually literally taking place right now. There's been a targeted attack launched by North Korea against security researchers, where they literally threw away 2 zero-day vulnerabilities, one of which was a 0-day that was a no-click vulnerability in Chrome, so that they could compromise security researchers, presumably to steal intelligence they had and any vulnerabilities they're working on. But those are really rare. The vast majority of cases you're looking at, people get organizations get compromised through people or through simple things. Phishing is still one of the number one vectors that allows people into companies. And so actually it's a lot of quite basic stuff that can be done that shuts the door on a lot of it. Even when you look at the SolarWinds side of things, there were so many missed opportunities in terms of defenses. We're guilty of not solving problems and rushing onto new ones all the time. If you look at the security industry, there's always something new and shiny that people move on to. But the reality is there are things that we leave behind us that aren't fixed. So why are we still seeing bugs appear that have been in code for decades? Just yesterday, a bug dropped in the Unix command sudo that's been in the code for 10 years. Why?
I have to interrupt you for a second, Mark, because this is triggering me personally. I am so triggered because I do this all the time. I start a million projects, I get the interesting bit done, and I'm just like, lose all interest. My GitHub repo or my GitHub organization, I look through it sometimes and I just feel this like soul crushing amount of guilt for all the things that I've started and just not finished all the way. So I totally understand how that can happen. But like, you know, it's so difficult. I feel like sometimes, like, what are you supposed to do? You know, like even things like sudo, like you're talking about, they might have been written in like the 1970s, right? And there's probably been thousands of people looking over this code over the years, but still things slip through the cracks. Like even all the testing in the world, sometimes it feels impossible to catch everything. Like what's your take on that?
You're right. You know, there are always going to be things that slip through. And I wouldn't necessarily make the assumption that thousands of people are looking at open source packages, because as we discovered with some of the SSL vulnerabilities, that's not the case. You have packages out there that are being maintained by half a dozen people, yet being used by thousands of organizations. There's sort of an imbalance there that needs to be fixed. And so one of the things is we should really encourage companies that are leveraging open source packages to invest back into those packages and to help them drive their security. But the other thing is there is really simple stuff that's getting missed all the time. Why are we still seeing directory traversal bugs like the one that came out for Citrix in 2020 and the one that followed immediately after that? Like, you know, these kind of bugs should have been killed in the F5s. That was it. These bugs should have been killed like decades ago. And there is no excuse for us not to have tooling that will find them. So the thing that we can do as developers in protecting this is to make sure that the low-hanging fruit is dealt with properly.
Dealing with the low-hanging fruit properly also reminds me of stories that I've been reading related to just old stuff that is lying around. And in data centers, it might be just that ancient box that's running old software or the router. And often what happens is, you know, people just forget about it and they just throw it in the you know, they just kind of ignore it.
Oh, Alex, that reminds me, man. I remember reading some stories a few years back about how some of the US nuclear launch systems have had no developers working on them in years, and they don't know how the code works, and like they don't even know where the code is sometimes. That is so scary to me.
Yeah, there are some terrifying things out there. It would probably really upset people to know just how many critical systems are running on things that have been in place for decades, because either the skills to reproduce the the system have been lost. People don't understand the code or the applications, or because people just say, well, if it's not broken, why do we need to fix it? I've been in those shoes myself. There was a time when I worked in ISPs back in the UK, and I moved off to work in telcos. And nearly a decade after leaving one particular ISP, I got a phone call from the senior staff in the ISP asking me for the root passwords for their mail server, because the thing had been running for a decade and they just had ignored it. And eventually it got to the point where I think one of the disks had filled up or something and it fell over, and suddenly they realized they didn't have access. And so they phoned me. Like, imagine getting a phone call from an employer like 10 years later saying, hey, do you remember this password?
All right. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, and don't lie. Okay. What was the password? Was it password 1, QWERTY123? Be honest.
No, actually, it was a pretty complex password, which is one of the reasons I think it was a problem. But like, some of us have been using password managers for a lot longer than others. And, we started out using PGP and other things to encrypt lists and moved on to more sophisticated, sexy things. But, the benefit of growing up in the industry is like there is no one as paranoid as a true security professional. But on the flip side, I've seen some egregious mistakes made by security professionals. One of my favorite ones I call the road to hell is paved with well-meaning automation. And there was a company that had a completely automated, one of the early automated CI/CD type environments where code would be sucked in at one end of a system from repositories, compiled, built, packaged, spat out, taken to a special package server, and then from that package server distributed to machines. But they'd gone to all these lengths of making sure that the code was properly checked and signed and dealt with and everything. But the one thing they hadn't done was look at the security of the package server. And so anyone who could create a new file on that package server, it would then be distributed out to the rest of the world. And so all of this extra stuff they'd built, because they broke that chain of trust, was worthless.
Absolutely crazy. This actually makes me think of another question I would love to ask you, Marc, because you've been in the security space for so long and just have seen a lot of really interesting things. As a security professional, here's my question. It seems like no matter what you're doing in the tech space, you're going to have security problems at some point. Even if you have all the best, the most well-intentioned things in mind, like you were just saying, maybe you try to automate everything to keep humans out of the loop. Maybe you go to extraordinary lengths to avoid risk. But at some point, you're going to be susceptible. What are some of those experiences that you think, any security professional is going to go through? Whether it's just SQL injection stuff or buffer overflows, whatever it is, like what are some of those common things that you still see on a regular basis that we just can't seem to escape in the industry?
So the first thing I'll say is I'd like to quote a friend of mine, Yoda. He said, the greatest teacher failure is. And it's true. You're going to fall and you're going to fail at some point. The trick is to make sure it's not too bad. And the other trick is, as those of us who end up in the management space, we have to make sure you have an environment that allows for that to happen and that doesn't go after, doesn't seek recrimination, that seeks to make these things known and resolved and dealt with. Because I've seen, like, the most common things are inappropriate use of credentials. Like, security people are paranoid, but sometimes sloppy, and they forget about stuff. The current North Korean attack that's going on, the guys who got caught out on it, some of the ones who got particularly got burnt because these guys were giving out Trojan code for them to look at, but the actual stinger was on the blog that had information about it and the PGP key. And so they were putting the code into sandboxes and they were treating it like it was radioactive. But then they went and browsed the blog, which had the 0-day, and boom, and suddenly their normal computers are getting popped. Like, these kinds of mistakes come up, and it's not our place to say you failed because of that. We just need to kind of analyze this and think, how do we stop this kind of stuff happening? The human factor is still the greatest Achilles heel any company has. And now that we're all distributed and working from home, you really have to ask yourself, does the security of a big organization literally boil down to what equipment somebody has in their house that was bought probably 5 years ago, maybe has never been patched, and is, wide open? So, I mean, not exactly what you were asking, but I think there's just too many mistakes to catalog them. I think it's just, we need to create a culture to expect them and to embrace them and to show people how to avoid them.
I would think that that culture of expectation has some roots in actually being calm, and paranoia makes sense. I hear it a lot about how security professionals are paranoid. But what often happens is the reactions just seem so wrong after the hack happens, where it's almost as if you're playing into the hands of the hackers themselves by trying to explain yourself out of a pretty embarrassing situation.
I couldn't agree more. I dislike the term APT because it's so often used as an excuse. Oh, we were breached by an APT, and so therefore we couldn't have done anything about it. Well, actually, the fact that you had an exposed, let's say Samba platform, which was running old Samba code and which was vulnerable, or an exposed Citrix platform, it doesn't really matter whether it was a nation state that popped you or some cybercrime group. You're exposing key infrastructure that should have been patched or should have been protected. And that's really the problem, not who did it.
When you're thinking about all of these hacks, and I know you did work on Mr. Robot and you did help kind of devise some of the hacks, how did you use your experience in helping a show like that in defining the hacks? And what were some of the twists that came from that, which you reflect upon as almost enlightening for yourself?
So I like to break stuff. I mean, Randall knows this from our time working together in Okta. You give me something, and the first thing I'll do is I'll look at it and work out how I can try and break it. And it gets annoying for people around me sometimes. Like, we go to the cinema and walk up to the ticket kiosk, and I'm pushing buttons and pressing in strange places to see if I can make it do something. I've reprogrammed elevators by playing around with things just because I wanted to see what happens. So I think that natural kind of mindset of inquiry is very common in all types of hackers, as is the kind of ADHD approach of looking at everything and moving on rapidly. I wouldn't describe ADHD as necessarily a disability for us. In fact, I'd describe it in some cases as our superpower. The fact is, anything can be broken, and I just try to find the way to do it. And some of the amusing things for me were, learning how easy some things are to break. So there was one particular skit that we had to put together for hacking the FBI, and we actually ended up talking to some real agents about exactly what the operations are like, and found some very clear holes in process that we could leverage. That was quite a surprise. The other thing was, I think I surprised some of the Hollywood folks in terms of how simple some things are, and the fact that actually, the elaborate movie style hack isn't necessarily the preferred thing. One case that comes to mind was they wanted a car to get hacked, and what they wanted was someone to basically take over a rideshare type car. Think of it as like one of those cars that you can lease and get into and then drive off yourself. And they normally have like an RFID badge that you put on the windscreen to get in, and online you've booked access to it and it's on a database. And so they had this whole complex scenario thought out where you break into the database and put in a fake account to program the card, and off you go. And I'm like, no, you walk up to the car and you pick up a brick and you smash the window and then you open the door, you get in the car. And because the way these things are designed, the keys are padlocked to the steering column. because they have to be present so you can press the start button. And now you press the start button and then you drive off. And they're like, but that's not safety.
That reminds me, I recently read a book talking about the takedown of Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road guy from back in the day. And like, you know, he did most things right. Like he was using Tor and using these, you know, disposable distros and keeping everything very safe. But he was at a public library, I think, working, and they set up a whole sting operation. So they distracted him. Someone ran, grabbed his computer while it was still open before he could touch a key to lock everything, and just game over. You know, all the crypto in the world isn't going to save you. So fascinating the way you can get around things sometimes.
There are some amazing stories in hacker legend about some of these types of solutions. There's a very famous one from the US where the hackers in question were hired by an escort agency to protect their data. And what they did was they drilled a hole in the side of the computer and attached a syringe filled with brass polish. And the idea was, if they heard a raid happening, they would slam the tube and it would inject brass polish into the disk, which would basically deoxidize the platter and just wipe it completely clean.
That's genius.
I mean, like, it's so simple, but it's like, you know, it ultimately failed because the person didn't have the nerve to press the plunger when the crisis happened, because it was so catastrophic. So, you know, you get a lot of folks who get tripped up by some of these things. And a lot of the famous bad guy takedowns have happened because of poor OPSEC and terrible metadata management. Like, they use the same account names right at the start as they do later on, or in one case they would have stolen parts shipped to their house and to their home address. And I even seem to recall one who took photos of his partner and posted them online and left the metadata in the images. So yes.
Pretty crazy. You know, Mark, I could listen to your stories all day. I find them absolutely fascinating, and it's so fun talking about this. One of the things about this podcast in particular is there's a ton of developers and makers who listen to it. And since our theme is along the lines of like security and how can we as engineers be better and just as makers do a better job with security, what is a piece of, you know, advice you would give to anyone listening to the show to maybe help them along, improve their security chops a bit?
So I would say, don't underestimate your ability to influence the overall security posture from where you are. Good development is the foundation on which good security is built. So things like moving away from insecure credentials towards secure tokens, which are handled in a responsible way, treated like evidence, you know, no break in the chain of custody. If you are instrumental in building that kind of stuff, you are making everything more secure. And the more you push those kinds of secure by design principles, the more the ecosystem is going to adopt them, and the more secure the world is going to become. It's the development space that I find drives security a lot of the time, especially the defensive side of security. You know, the removal of insecure keys and credentials, the improvement of code linting, and the removal of common developer mistakes. You know, all of that stuff might seem inconsequential, but to put together, if you create a culture where that's going on, you're going to elevate security like 100%.
I have so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much, Marc, for joining us. Marc Rogers is Vice President of Cybersecurity at Okta and co-founder of the CTI League. Maybe you can just tell us what the CTI League is before we go.
Sure. CTI League is a voluntary organization with 1,500 members from 80 countries and covering 22 time zones that comes together from across the industry, from law enforcement, from government, to protect healthcare. We work to protect hospitals, first responders, to stop attacks against those people who are working on the front lines of the pandemic.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's a great effort. And the show has been co-hosted and will continue to be co-hosted by Randall Degges, Head of Developer Advocacy at Okta. thank you so much for your great questions and insights and bringing Marc onto this show. This has been a lot of fun it's been a lot of fun just to hear the stories. I mean, basically that's it for me. I mean, I love the extensions for where these discussions can go. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. And Marc, thanks again, man. This has been super fun for me in particular. Even if the audience enjoys it, that's great, but this is primarily for me to enjoy. So I'm just going to enjoy that while I can.
My pleasure. Now, what I will say to anyone out there is come find me at DEF CON and come find me at any of the other community events that I usually am found hanging out. And for the price of a refreshing drink, I'll happily tell you more and more stories.
You got a deal. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.